That summer, Savannah was so hot the asphalt on River Street softened under the sun, and the ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss stood motionless, like sleeping giants. Behind a high red brick wall at the edge of the historic district, the live oak estate sat in the middle of a garden so vast a person could get lost in it. But for 11 months now, the house had been missing the one thing that had ever made it a home: laughter. Harlan Whitmore was one of the wealthiest men in the state of Georgia. His empire stretched from rows of coastal real estate to a fleet of cargo ships moving through the port of Savannah. People called him the Golden Hand because anything he touched turned to money. But few people knew that the most precious thing in Harlan's life had never been kept in a vault. It had been a woman named Rosalind. Rosalind was not born into silk and marble. Before she met Harlan, she was a music teacher at a small kindergarten on the west side of town, scraping by on a modest salary, riding to work on an old bicycle with a woven basket on the handlebars. Harlan met her at a fundraiser, where she sat in a circle of small children with a guitar, singing a song she had written herself. A song about fireflies lighting their lamps when darkness falls. He would say, years later, that in a room full of men in suits talking about money, she was the only person who was truly alive. They married a year later. Rosalind never let the mansion swallow her. She walked barefoot in the kitchen, turned on the radio, and pulled her husband out to dance between the pots and pans while the housekeepers hid their smiles. When Ivy was born, she folded the Firefly song into every evening, singing her daughter to sleep by the window that looked out on the garden, where tiny points of light drifted between the oak trunks. Ivy grew up believing that fireflies were the little lamps her mother lit for her. Then came the rainy night in August, 1 year ago. The family car was returning from a concert on Tybee Island, running along the coastal road, slick with water. All anyone knew was what the police report said. The car slid off the pavement at the curve near the marsh and rolled twice. Rosalind was gone before the ambulance arrived. Ivy, 8 years old, survived. But her legs no longer moved, and something inside her had stopped moving on that same rainy night. From then on, Ivy almost never left her room. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She simply sat by the window for hours, staring out at the garden where the fireflies still lit their lamps each evening, as if waiting for someone who would never come back. Harlan fought it with everything money could buy. He flew his daughter to Germany for therapy, to Switzerland for consultations, brought the most expensive doctors in America to the house. Every scan said the same baffling thing. The nerves were damaged, but not severed. In theory, the girl had a chance. In reality, she did not move. An elderly specialist from Atlanta, on his way out the door, said something Harlan could never forget. "Mr. Whitmore, we can treat the legs, but not one of us can treat the reason she doesn't want to stand up." To the world, Harlan remained a man of steel. He signed contracts, chaired meetings, and his voice never wavered. But every night, after the whole house had gone to sleep, the staff would see him walk out into the garden and sit down on the stone bench beneath the largest oak, the bench where Rosalind used to sit when she sang to Ivy. He sat there for a long time, doing nothing, just sitting. One night, the old butler passed by and heard him whisper into the dark, "I don't know what to do anymore, Rosie. Show me, please." No one answered him. And the next morning, he knotted his tie and became the golden hand of Savannah once again. A man who had everything, except a way to save his daughter. Less than 2 miles from the Live Oak estate, on the other side of everything, lived an 11-year-old boy named Denny. Denny had no home. He slept under the overpass near the bus station or in the corners of half-built construction sites where the concrete held a little of the day's warmth. No one around River Street knew his story because Denny rarely told it. But if someone had bothered to ask, and bothered to wait, they would have heard about a cramped boarding room on the south side of town, an old radio, and a woman named Laureen. Laureen was his mother. She had been a dancer at a small nightclub, no grand stage, no colored lights, just a bar where she danced to pay the rent. But to Denny, his mother was the greatest artist who ever lived. On the evenings she didn't have to work, she would turn on the radio, pull her 6-year-old son up onto his bare feet, and place his tiny hand on hers. "When you're sad," she said, spinning him in a circle, "don't sit still. Sitting still means the sadness wins. You have to move. Move, and the sadness gets lighter." He didn't fully understand the words at 6. He only remembered giggling, remembered the creaky wooden floor under his feet, the smell of cheap soap on his mother's blouse. He didn't know then that this one sentence would become the only thing that kept him alive. Laureen fell ill the winter Denny turned 7. The sickness came fast and cruel, as if it knew she had no money to fight it. In her final weeks, she could no longer stand, but she still held her son's hand, swaying it gently to the radio. "Dance for me." And Denny danced, alone in the middle of the boarding room, while his mother watched with eyes that were already tired. She died before Christmas. His father, Wade Merrill, a man who was rarely there and always smelled of liquor when he was, stood at the funeral with an ash-gray face, then vanished completely 3 days later. He left no note, no address, not even a single photograph. Denny didn't own one picture of his mother. The landlord sold off everything in the room to cover the back rent. The only thing the boy carried out with him was the one thing no one could take: the dance. 4 years on the streets taught Denny lessons no child should have to learn. He learned which corners were safe to sleep on. He learned to eat fast because food left sitting was food snatched away. He learned that most adults look straight through a ragged child, the way they look through a dirty window. But he learned this, too. When he was too hungry to sleep, he danced. When he was chased out of a store, he danced. When he missed his mother so much his chest ached, he went to an intersection, sprang into the steps she had taught him, and sometimes people tossed him loose change. But the money was never the real reason. The real reason was that every time he lifted his feet, he could feel his mother's hand resting on his, warm, as if she had never left. The dance was the only photograph of his mother he had left, and he kept it with his whole body. On the first afternoon, Denny only meant to walk past. He was wandering along the brick wall of the Live Oak estate, looking for shade. Through a gap where last year's storm had torn open the hedgerow, he saw the garden. And in the middle of the garden, a little girl in a wheelchair. She was younger than him, pale blonde hair in a crooked ponytail, her cheek resting on the armrest, her eyes staring down at the grass. Empty. Something stirred in Denny's chest. He knew that expression. He had seen it on his own face, reflected in the shop windows he passed. It was the face of someone waiting to be seen, who no longer believed anyone would look. I know what sadness is, Denny thought. If I dance, maybe she'll laugh. He slipped through the gap, stopped a short distance from her, and without a word, began to dance. He did the silliest routine he knew, flailing his arms like a clown, pretending to slip, catching himself with maximum drama. Ivy looked up. She stared at him for about 3 seconds, then turned her face away, cheek back on the armrest, as if he were nothing but a passing leaf. Denny froze mid-move. He was used to being shooed off by adults, but being looked through by another child hurt in a different way. He quietly retreated toward the gap in the hedge, but just before he disappeared, he glanced back and caught the girl's eyes following him. 1 second, then she snapped her gaze away. Only 1 second, but for a child who had survived 4 years on scraps, 1 second was a feast. On the second afternoon, Denny came back. This time he was prepared. He had practiced all morning behind the abandoned newsstand, working out a bit where he played a robot running out of battery mid-motion. He danced so hard his ragged shirt soaked through with sweat. Ivy didn't laugh, but she didn't turn away either. She watched, and at the part where Denny pretended his own arms slapped him in the face, the corner of her mouth twitched. A movement so small, it might have been the wind. Right then, a guard's footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Denny shot through the gap like a squirrel, heart hammering, but his mouth was grinning. The corner of her mouth, it moved. On the third afternoon, the air was thick enough to choke on. Denny slipped into the garden, and for the first time, he saw that the wheelchair wasn't in its usual spot. It had been rolled closer to the hedge, closer to the gap, as if someone had been waiting. Denny flashed his teeth and raised both arms like a circus performer greeting the crowd. Then he danced. He spun, he hopped on one foot, he pretended to trip over his own leg, fell flat in the grass, sprang up regally, bowed like a king, and crossed his eyes. And Ivy laughed. Not a polite smile, not a twitch at the corner of her mouth. It was laughter that burst straight out of her chest, clear and unrestrained, ringing across the garden like wind chimes. The sound startled even her. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, then laughed harder, like a dam finally giving way. On the second-floor balcony, Harlan Whitmore was on a business call. Forgot what sentence he was in the middle of.
11 months. He had not heard that laugh in 11 months.
He stepped to the edge of the balcony, and for a moment he did not believe his own eyes. His daughter was laughing, clapping, her cheeks flushed pink. And the source of it was not medicine, not therapy, not anything he had ever bought. It was a barefoot boy in ragged clothes, dancing in his garden. Harlan's first reaction was the familiar anger of a father who had been hurting too long. Who is that kid? How did he get in? Where's security? What if he's dangerous? His hand was already on the railing, his mouth already open to shout. But then he looked at Ivy. Her back, the back that had been curled forward for months as if under an invisible stone, was straightening. Her hands were clapping with a life he had thought was gone. Slowly, Harlan closed his mouth. He stepped back behind the marble column and did something the golden hand of Savannah had never done in any deal of his life. He stood still, and he watched. Harlan Whitmore had not become a billionaire by trusting people after one afternoon. That night, he called his head of security into the study. "There's a boy who's been sneaking into the garden for 3 days," he said. "Don't stop him. Find out who he is." 2 days later, a thin file lay on his desk. Thin because the life of a homeless child leaves very little paperwork. Name: Denny Merrill, age 11. Mother deceased 4 years ago. Father gone, whereabouts unknown. No school records since 2nd grade, no arrests. A vendor at the bus station said the boy danced for spare change and mentioned one strange thing. On the days he earned well, he bought bread and split it with 2 smaller kids who slept under the same overpass. "The boy's hungry," the vendor said, "but I've never once seen him eat before the little ones did." Harlan read that line twice. Then he closed the file and decided to do what he did with every partner before signing a major contract. He tested. The next afternoon, when Denny slipped through the gap in the hedge as usual, he saw something strange on the stone table in the middle of the garden. A silver music box, its lid inlaid with a delicate pattern glittering in the sun. The kind of thing that would feed a person for a month at any pawn shop. Next to it, a fat leather wallet, as if someone had forgotten it there. Denny looked at the 2 objects. He knew what they were worth. 4 years on the street had taught him to appraise anything in half a second. He also knew the hunger growling in his stomach, because yesterday he had eaten only half a loaf of bread. He walked around the table, went to Ivy, and began to dance. Halfway through the performance, a sudden summer downpour broke open the sky. A housekeeper hurried Ivy's wheelchair to the veranda. Denny turned to run for the hedge, then stopped, looking at the music box and the wallet catching rain on the stone table. He went back, pulled off his outer shirt, his ragged shirt, the only one he owned, draped it over the 2 objects, tucked the corner under the box so the wind couldn't lift it, and only then ran off into the rain, bare-chested, thin as a stick of kindling. From his study window, Harlan witnessed all of it. He stood there a long time after the boy's silhouette had vanished, staring at the soaked rag of a shirt sheltering the silver music box. The box that had belonged to Rosalind. Something rose slowly in his chest, a feeling that was part shame and part reverence. He, the richest man in Savannah, had just set a trap for a hungry child. And the hungry child had answered it by giving away the only shirt he had. The next afternoon, when Denny slipped through the hedge, Harlan Whitmore was standing in the middle of the garden, waiting. Denny went rigid. He knew the look wealthy adults gave a street kid, the look that usually came right before a dismissive wave or a call to the police. His muscles were already primed to run.
"Daddy,"
Ivy's voice rang out from the veranda.
"don't send him away, please."
But Harlan wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at the boy. Really looking, for the first time. The ragged shirt, dried out now, back on the skinny frame, the bare feet, the old scars on the knees, and the eyes, wary, tired, but strangely calm. Not begging, not defiant, just calm. "What's your name?" Harlan asked.
"Denny, sir."
"Why did you come in here?" Denny swallowed.
"I saw her through the hedge. She looked so sad. I thought if I danced, she might laugh. I'm not here to take anything, sir. The dance is the only thing I have to give."
Harlan was silent for a long moment. Then he asked his last question. "Where do you live?"
"Anywhere, sir,"
Denny answered.
"The bus station, under the bridge. I dance for food money. And when there's no money, I dance anyway. So the hunger doesn't win."
So the hunger doesn't win. Harlan felt the sentence pass straight through his suit jacket, through 30 years of boardrooms, and touch something very old inside him. It was the sentence of a person who had learned to survive before he had learned to read. "All right," he said. You come at 4 o'clock every afternoon. You leave at 6. You stay in the open where I can see you. And before you go, you eat a meal first." Denny blinked, not sure he had heard right. On the veranda, Ivy clapped and cheered, and Harlan Whitmore turned and walked back into the house very quickly, before anyone could see what his face looked like in that moment. One day became a week. A week became a month. Denny arrived at exactly 4 o'clock each afternoon, as reliable as the tide. He brought new material, the spinning top dance, a one-boy pantomime of the bus drivers arguing at the depot, a police siren impression that made Ivy laugh until her shoulders shook. But underneath the clowning, something else was quietly happening. Ivy's hands grew stronger from clapping. She began lifting her arms to mirror Denny's moves. Her voice thickened back into itself. She ordered, "Do it again," she complained. "Yesterday's version was better." She spun her wheelchair in small circles on the grass, while Denny spun on his feet. And one afternoon, Harlan, who now always found a reason to work at the table on the veranda, saw his daughter's toes flex faintly inside her canvas shoes. He said nothing. He was afraid that if he called the miracle by its name, it would dissolve. At the next scheduled checkup, the doctor looked at Ivy's reflex measurements and then took off his glasses, something he had never done in any previous visit. "Mr. Whitmore, let me be plain. Your daughter's motor nerves were damaged in the crash, but they were never severed. For almost a year, the problem hasn't been in her spine. It's been that her brain stopped sending commands to her legs. After a shock like that, the mind can lock itself down, out of fear, out of grief, out of things no scanner can see. But the signals are coming back now. I don't know what you're doing at home, but whatever it is, don't stop. This is not a miracle. This is a little girl giving herself permission to live again." The first milestone came on an afternoon of slanting sunlight. Denny was doing his slow-motion routine, moving as if the air had thickened around him, and Ivy laughed so hard she forgot to hold the thin blanket on her lap. "Wait," she said suddenly, breathless. "Let me try something." She set both hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. Her face tightened. For one heartbeat, nothing. Then her shoulders rose, and slowly, trembling, her hips lifted off the seat, 1 finger's width, then 2. "1," Denny whispered, eyes wide. "2," Harlan counted, walking down from the veranda without realizing he was walking. 3. Ivy sank back into the chair, panting, and smiled, her eyes wet. The silence that settled over the garden was unlike any silence of the past 11 months. It was the kind of silence that comes after a prayer has been answered in a way no one expected. But not everything inside Ivy was getting lighter. There were stones that lay deeper than her legs. One afternoon before Denny arrived, Harlan found his daughter sitting motionless by the window, a photograph of Rosalind on her lap. He was about to withdraw quietly when Ivy spoke, so softly he almost missed it.
"Daddy, I'm starting to forget Mama's voice."
Harlan went still in the doorway.
"I try to remember how she sounded,"
the girl went on, eyes still on the photograph.
"but it keeps fading, like a radio losing its station. And Daddy,
Her small shoulders began to shake.
that night, Mama was in the front seat. I was in the back. I lived. She didn't. Why me, Daddy? It should have been Ivy."
Harlan dropped to his knees in front of her so fast his kneecaps cracked against the wooden floor. He took her small shoulders in his hands, and for the first time since the funeral, the steel voice of Savannah broke. "Listen to me. You are not alive because you took something from your mother. You are alive because in the very last second, she turned around and wrapped herself around you."
The police told me her seatbelt was unbuckled.
She chose that. Do you understand? It was the last thing she ever did in this world. And she would never want you to carry guilt for the gift she gave you. Ivy cried. Really cried, for the first time since the funeral. Not the silent tears by the window, but sobbing, gasping, crying the way an 8-year-old should have been allowed to cry 11 months ago. And Harlan held her, let her soak the shoulder of his shirt, understanding at last that her legs had never been the deepest wound. What he did not yet know was that the dancing boy out there carried the very same wound, and that he would be the one to find the medicine no doctor could prescribe. That Saturday afternoon, Harlan invited Denny to sit with him in the garden. For the first time, the boy was not asked to dance. He was asked to tell. And Denny told, haltingly at first, because no one had ever asked about him, about the boarding room, the old radio, the dancer mother, the sentence, "Sitting still means the sadness wins," the father who vanished after the funeral.
"Every time I dance,"
he said, his voice catching at the end,
"it's like her hand is still holding mine. I don't have a picture of her. Not one. The dance is the only photograph I have left."
Harlan sat in silence for a long time. He had studied at the finest schools, met the greatest minds, and yet in front of him sat an 11-year-old who had found, on his own, the truth that all his millions could not buy. The people we love never truly leave, as long as we keep what they left behind. "You know," he said quietly, "Ivy lost her mother that same night, and she's afraid she's forgetting the sound of her mother's voice." Denny looked up. The next afternoon, after his performance, he didn't say goodbye right away. He sat down on the grass beside Ivy's wheelchair, was quiet for a while, and then said,
"I don't have a mom either."
Ivy's head whipped around, eyes wide.
"Are you scared of forgetting her?"
he asked. Ivy nodded, her throat closing.
"Me too,"
Denny said.
"But you know what I do? My mom taught me to dance. So every time I dance, she comes back. You should find something too, something your mom used to do, and do it every day. Do it forever. Then you'll never forget."
Ivy was silent for a long time. Then she said softly,
"My mama used to sing a song she wrote herself about fireflies." "Then sing it,"
Denny said.
"Sing it every night. Think of it like lighting a lamp so she can find her way back."
That night, Harlan passed his daughter's room and heard a sound that made him grip the doorframe. Ivy was singing. Softly, off rhythm, unsteady. The song about fireflies lighting their lamps when darkness falls. Rosalind's song, rising for the first time in 11 months, inside the very house where she had written it. Harlan stood in the dark hallway and wept without a sound. The street boy had given his daughter the one thing all his fortune had never known how to give: a way to hold on to her mother.
There was a secret in the live oak estate that Denny discovered by accident.
That evening, he had left later than usual. The old butler had kept him back to mend his torn shirt. As he cut across the garden toward the gate, he saw a figure sitting on the stone bench under the great oak. It was Mr. Whitmore, sitting alone in the dark, his back bowed in a way it never was in daylight, talking to no one at all. "She's singing again, Rosie. Your song.
She is singing again, Rosie.
I wish you could hear it." Denny stopped dead on the gravel path. He knew he should keep walking, pretend he hadn't seen. Adults did not like being caught in their weak moments. 4 years on the street had taught him that. But there was something else his mother had taught him long before the street. He walked over and sat down on the far end of the stone bench. Harlan flinched, straightened his back at once, put his daytime face back on. "Denny, why are you still here?" "Sir," Denny said, not answering the question, "do you sit on this bench every night?" Harlan was silent. Then, perhaps because darkness makes every confession easier, he nodded. This was her place. She used to sit here and sing to Ivy. Denny nodded slowly, the comically solemn nod of an 11-year-old. Then he asked, "So, do you ever move with the sadness, sir? Or do you only ever sit still with it?" Harlan turned to look at the boy. "My mom used to say," Denny went on, watching the first fireflies begin to blink between the tree trunks, "sitting still means the sadness wins. I see you give Miss Ivy everything so she can move. Doctors, medicine, even me. But you just sit on the stone bench." The richest man in Savannah opened his mouth to say that adults were different, that the boy wouldn't understand. But he couldn't say it, because he suddenly realized this boy understood better than he did. The boy had lost his mother, lost his home, and he still danced. Harlan let out a sound that was half laugh, half something breaking. "I can't dance, son. Rosalind dragged me around the kitchen for 20 years and I never stopped stepping on her feet." "You don't have to know how, sir," Denny said, standing up and holding out his hand. Exactly the way his mother had once held out hers in the boarding room. "You just have to sway. When you sway, the sadness has to loosen its grip a little." And so, beneath the oldest oak in Savannah, in a garden full of fireflies, the billionaire Harlan Whitmore rose from the stone bench and swayed, clumsy and stiff, to the rhythm of a homeless boy's clapping. He did everything wrong. He was rigid as a fence post, and at some point, mid-sway, he began to laugh, and then the laughing became crying, and then it became laughing again. And Denny just kept clapping, asking nothing, because he knew better than anyone that some dances look exactly like rain. 2 weeks later, Ivy stood up. It happened in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Denny was doing his robot routine when Ivy suddenly shouted,
"I want to try standing!"
startling even herself. She planted her hands on the armrests, pushed hard, her face crumpling with effort. One knee trembled and straightened, then the other. She couldn't stand upright, her small body curved like a question mark, but her feet were pressing down into the earth, and the earth was holding her, for the first time since the rainy night. 3 seconds. Her whole small body shook like a leaf. Then she let herself down into the chair and burst out laughing.
"I stood! Did you see me, Daddy? I stood!"
That day, the live oak estate rang with the cheers of the guards, the housekeepers, the old butler who set down his entire tea tray to applaud. And that night, Harlan found Denny sitting alone on the back steps, arms wrapped around his knees, staring into the dark as if unsure he was allowed to share in the joy. Harlan sat down beside him. "You shouldn't be sitting out here alone." "I'm used to it, sir." "Not anymore. Harlan's voice was as firm as a signed and sealed contract. "This is your home now, Denny. I spoke with my lawyer this morning. You will eat 3 meals a day, sleep in a bed, go to school, and you will never again have to wonder where you'll sleep tonight. Now listen to me." He turned fully toward the boy. "I know what you've given this family. It isn't Ivy's laughter. You gave all 3 of us the same thing, hope. And a person who brings hope is not a guest. That person is family." Denny couldn't speak. His throat locked, and for the first time in 4 years, he let his tears fall in front of an adult. Because for the first time in 4 years, he believed the adult would not use them to hurt him. The news spread through Savannah within a week. Billionaire Whitmore takes in street child. Headlines flared, neighbors whispered, a few business partners called with veiled remarks about the company's image. Harlan brushed them all aside. Only one man made him sit down and listen. Curtis Pruitt, an old friend from their early days hauling freight at the port. "Harlan, I'm not saying this for the sake of your image," Curtis said, lowering his voice, and something in his eyes made Harlan go quiet. "You know how I grew up. Foster homes. One after another. When I was 10, a family took me in. 2 years. I called them Mom and Dad. Then they gave me back, like returning merchandise that didn't fit. Do you know what that does to a child? It's worse than never being chosen at all. So I'm asking you one thing. Don't give that boy hope unless you're certain you'll keep him. If the day comes when Ivy is well again and you decide the boy has served his purpose, you will destroy him in ways you can't imagine." Harlan was silent a long time, because this was not selfishness. This was a 40-year-old wound speaking. "Curtis," he said at last, "thank you for telling me the truth. But you're wrong about one thing. I'm not the one giving that boy hope. He gave it to me. And a man does not return the thing that saved his life." Curtis studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then don't ever prove me right, Harlan. For the rest of your life, don't prove me right."
That November, the Live Oak Estate held its first Thanksgiving since the accident.
The long table was laid with white linen, a golden roast turkey, and 2 special chairs. The first, at Harlan's right hand, sat empty, with Rosalind's place fully set, as it had been every year of her life. The second was brand new, placed beside Ivy. "This house has one rule," Harlan said when Denny hesitated in front of the new chair. "The table is allowed to grow longer, but no one's place is ever taken away." Denny sat down, looked at the empty chair of a woman he had never met, then at the faces around the table. And he understood something about this house. It did not fill its empty spaces by forgetting. It filled them by loving more. Magnolia Prep was one of the most prestigious schools in Savannah. Cream-painted walls, a courtyard shaded by magnolia trees, students in crisply ironed uniforms and polished shoes. The night before his first day, Denny sat in his room, staring at the new uniform folded on the chair. His fingers ran over the stiff fabric, the finest cloth he had ever touched. But his stomach held only a knot.
What if I do not fit in?
What if I don't fit in? What if they see what I really am? Harlan knocked and came in. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Denny, I won't promise you it will be easy. There will be whispers, there will be kids who test you. But hear me, you don't have to prove you belong there. A boy who dared to dance at an intersection to beat back hunger belongs anywhere he chooses to stand. And if there's ever a moment you feel small, remember, even kings were once children nobody believed in." The first weeks were harder than Denny had imagined. In class, he answered honestly, and a few kids mimicked his bus station accent. At lunch, they laughed at how fast he ate, hunched over his tray, the habit of a child whose food had been snatched before. "A street kid at Magnolia Prep," a voice whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "Wait till exams. he'll flunk right out. The ringleader was Tucker Vance, tallest boy in the grade, son of a bank president, his face permanently set in a smirk that seemed to say the whole world owed him an apology. One Thursday at lunch, Tucker walked past Denny's table and knocked his tray to the floor. The whole table roared. Denny knelt and picked up the food piece by piece, his hands shaking. Not from fear, but because he knew the price of every one of those pieces, in a way no child in that cafeteria could. There was one thing Denny saw that afternoon that he didn't understand until much later. In the pickup line, Tucker's father stood beside a gleaming car, holding his son's test paper, and he was shouting so loudly that the other parents turned away. "A B plus? The Vances don't get B pluses. You trying to embarrass me?" Tucker stood with his head down, shoulders drawn in, looking half his size. Denny watched from a distance, and for 1 second, he recognized that face. The face of a child waiting for someone to see him. But the sting of the spilled tray was still too fresh, and so he turned away. That night, Denny packed a few clothes into a canvas bag. He sat by the window, looking down at the estate gate. "I don't belong here. Sooner or later they'll figure it out. Mr. Whitmore will figure it out. And then I'll be given back, like Mr. Curtis. Better to leave first." He got halfway over the windowsill, one leg in, one leg out, straddling the exact border between two lives. Then he heard singing. From the room across the hall, Ivy was softly singing the Firefly song, the song he had told her to sing so she wouldn't forget her mother. "When darkness falls, the fireflies light their lamps." Her voice was far steadier now than it had been that first night. She sang every night, without missing one, exactly as he told her to. Denny froze on the windowsill. He thought of Ivy's face if his room were empty in the morning. He thought of Mr. Whitmore swaying clumsily under the oak tree. He thought of his mother. Sitting still means the sadness wins. Then what about running away? Running away means the fear wins. He climbed back inside, unpacked the bag, and lay down on the soft bed, heart still pounding, but on the right side of the window.
The next morning, Harlan asked nothing. But passing Denny's room, he had seen the half-packed bag on the chair. All he did was rest a hand on the boy's shoulder at breakfast and say, "I'm glad you're still here." 6 words, and Denny understood that he knew, and wanted him to stay anyway. Sometimes that is the entire definition of a family. Meanwhile, Ivy was fighting her own quiet war. She could walk short distances now, slow and wobbling, one hand always ready to grab for support. At school, some kids clapped when she entered the courtyard, but there were whispers too. "Look at her limp. Bet she falls." There were days Ivy wanted nothing more than to retreat to the wheelchair. At least no one could mock the way she sat. But one afternoon at recess, she stopped in the middle of the courtyard and began to walk across it, in front of everyone. Step by step, slow, unsteady, determined. Halfway across, she wavered. The whole courtyard drew one breath. "You've got this!" Denny came running from somewhere, not to hold her up, just to walk beside her, clapping in rhythm with her steps. "One more. Your rhythm, not theirs." Ivy lifted her head, gripped that clapping rhythm like an invisible handrail, and walked the courtyard to its end. When her palm touched the far wall, the whispers had died completely. A few kids began to applaud. Ivy turned around, cheeks blazing, eyes bright, and in the far corner of the courtyard, Tucker Vance stood watching. No smirk, just watching, with an expression no one could read.
Well done, Ivy.
In late September, a tropical storm swept up the Georgia coast. It wasn't strong enough to do real damage to Savannah, just a night of gusting wind and rain lashing the window panes. For most of the city, it was one bad night's sleep. For Ivy, it was the rainy night in August come back. The first thunderclap broke just before midnight. The housekeeper found the girl curled in the corner of her room, hands clamped over her ears, her whole body shaking, repeating one sentence no one understood.
Mama, don't turn around. Mama, watch the road. Mama, please don't turn around.
Harlan held his daughter through the night, and Denny sat outside her door until dawn, his back against the wall, refusing to go to bed, though no one had asked him to stay. The next morning, when Harlan helped his daughter sit up, Ivy's legs did not answer. Not weakened, not answering like 11 months ago. She stared down at her own legs, commanded them with every ounce of will that months of training had built, and they lay still, as if they belonged to someone else. Ivy didn't cry. She just sat there, and the light in her eyes began to go out. The going out that everyone in that house had sworn never to see again.
Try the left one.
The doctor came that morning, examined her for a long time, then drew Harlan into the hallway. Physically, there's no new damage. This is what I once warned you about, the psychological block. The storm dragged her back to the night of the crash, and her brain threw the breaker again to protect itself. This can be reversed. It was reversed once before. But I have to be honest with you, the second time is always harder, because now the child knows that hope can be taken back. But the person who broke hardest in that house, it turned out, was not Ivy. It was Denny. He had overheard the hallway conversation, and a single thought lodged in his chest like a shard of glass. I gave her false hope. I made her believe she was healed. If she'd never believed it, she wouldn't be hurting like this today. For the whole week that followed, Denny did not dance. He still sat beside Ivy every afternoon, still told her stories from school, but his legs, the legs that had refused to stay still through 4 starving years, stayed planted on the ground. The live oak garden, for the first time since summer, fell silent at 4 o'clock. One evening, Harlan found him sitting on the back steps, the same spot as before. He sat down beside him and said nothing for a while. Then he asked, "What was it your mother used to say? The thing you taught me under the oak tree?" Denny didn't answer. "Sitting still," Harlan answered for him, "means the sadness wins." He turned to his adopted son. "Denny, listen to me. You did not give Ivy false hope. You gave her real hope, and real hope gets hit by storms sometimes. That oak out there has stood for 200 years. Every storm on this coast has taken a swing at it, and it's still standing. Do you know why? Because its roots are real. What you planted in Ivy is roots, not paper flowers. So what's your plan now? Sit still beside her and let the sadness beat you both?" The answer didn't come from Denny. It came from the veranda door behind them, where Ivy had been listening from her wheelchair for who knows how long, having pushed herself out with her own 2 arms, the arms that months of clapping had made strong. "Denny," she said, her voice small but steady. "Let me tell you about that night. I've never told anyone. Not even Daddy." And in the garden of the fading afternoon, Ivy told. About the rain drumming on the roof of the car. About the windshield wipers swinging back and forth like a metronome. About her mother in the front seat, turning her head around to sing the Firefly song to her, getting as far as the middle of the line. When darkness falls, the fireflies light their lamps. When headlights from the curve blazed straight through the glass, about the shriek of the tires, and about the last thing she saw before the world turned over. Her mother punching the seatbelt loose, twisting her whole body around, arms flung wide to wrap around her. No time to say a word, but her mother's face, in that tenth of a second, held no fear at all. Her mother's face held one single thing: the determination to reach her child.
For a whole year, I thought Mama died because of me.
Ivy said, tears running but her voice pushing forward.
The night of the storm, I saw it all again, and my legs died again. But sitting still these past days, I kept thinking and thinking, and I figured something out. Mama didn't die because of me. Mama chose me.
In the last half second of her life, she got to choose one thing, and she chose to hold me. If I sit still for the rest of my life, that half second of hers was wasted. She lifted her eyes to Denny and said the sentence he would carry to the end of his days. So you have to dance again, because if you sit still, the sadness beats both of us. And I need somebody to clap for, so my arms stay strong, so my legs can follow. Denny looked at his 8-year-old sister, sitting in a wheelchair, teaching him back his own mother's lesson. He rose from the steps. His legs felt weighted with stone, but he lifted them. And he danced. Clumsy at first, like a machine too long without oil. Then smoother, then flying. Ivy clapped, Harlan clapped, and the live oak garden, after 2 silent weeks, began to breathe again. The poster appeared on the Magnolia Prep announcement board in the first week of November. Winter Talent Showcase, Dance Category. Sign up by Friday. Denny had signed up before the storm, and during the dark days he had quietly crossed his own name off the list. Now he stood in front of the board, pen in hand, and wrote his name again, right over the strike-through. The second signature was darker than the first. From that day on, the live oak garden became a rehearsal stage, and Ivy became the toughest coach in the state of Georgia. Again. No, wider on the spin. Slower here, like the day you danced for Daddy. She commanded from the wheelchair, and alongside Denny's rehearsals, she ran her own physical therapy sessions that this time no one had to coax her into. In week 3, her hips lifted off the seat again. 1, 2, 3. In week 5, her knees straightened. Slower than the first time, and it hurt more than the first time. But this time, every inch she won belonged to her, and nothing could take it back. And Denny wasn't rehearsing clown routines anymore. He began working his mother's real steps into the piece, the fluid moves Laureen had done in the boarding room, a choreography with no name and no school, made of nothing but breath and memory. I want to bring Mom onto the stage, he told Ivy, but I don't know what music fits. Her music lived in the old radio, and the radio's been gone for years. Ivy tilted her head, quiet for a moment, like someone slipping a secret into her pocket. Denny's 12th birthday fell the week before the showcase, the first birthday of his life with a cake on the table. After he blew out the candles, Ivy rolled her chair over and laid a flat parcel on his lap, wrapped clumsily in brown paper. I've been working on this forever, she said, suddenly shy. If I got anything wrong, don't be mad, okay? Denny peeled back the paper. Inside was a picture frame, and inside the frame, painted in watercolor, was a woman dancing in a small room, hair tied low, bare feet on a wooden floor, one hand extended forward as if inviting someone in, and beside the bed, an old radio. It's your mom, Ivy said. I didn't have a photo. So I painted her from your words. All those months I kept asking you things. Did she tie her hair high or low? Which side of the room did she stand on? What color was the radio? You thought I was just being nosy, right? I wrote it all down. You said you didn't have a single picture of her. Now you have one. Denny sat motionless for a long time, his finger hovering over the glass, not daring to touch it, as if the image might dissolve. He, the boy who had given this house so much laughter, realized for the first time that he was also someone who could be given to. He couldn't manage a thank you. He just pressed the frame against his chest and dropped his head, and the family let him cry, because some tears are the ribbon-cutting ceremony of a home. The night of the showcase arrived. The Magnolia Prep Auditorium blazed with light, every row packed with parents. In the wings, Denny's hands were ice. Ivy, walking short distances now but seated safely in the front row tonight, had drilled him since the afternoon. Close your eyes. Think of the garden. Just you dancing and me clapping. Next up, Denny Whitmore. The whispering started instantly. That's the street kid. What's he doing here? Denny stepped into the ring of light. The music began, and he froze. Not because he'd forgotten the routine, because in that sea of light and unfamiliar faces, he suddenly could not find his mother. The boarding room would not appear. The hand would not appear. 3 seconds passed. 5. The whispers rose like water.
What is he doing?
At the judges' table, someone had already picked up a pen. Then, from the front row, a sound lifted into the air. And it was not applause. It was a voice, singing. Ivy was gripping the back of the seat in front of her, pulling herself up onto her feet, her trembling legs bearing her weight before 400 people. And she was singing. No microphone, no accompaniment. Just a child's voice, ringing through an auditorium that had gone rigid. When darkness falls, the fireflies light their lamps. Rosalind's song. The sound technician, by some instinct, eased the backing track down. And on the stage, Denny opened his eyes. He no longer saw the auditorium. He saw 2 mothers, one living in the song, one living in his own legs. And he began to dance Laureen's dance to Rosalind's melody. The steps of a poor boarding room flowing into the song of a wealthy garden. 2 women who had never met in life, now meeting inside the 2 children they had left behind. He danced slowly, fluidly, one hand extended forward as if inviting in someone invisible, the exact posture of the woman in the watercolor painting. The auditorium was silent as snowfall. This was no longer a street kid's talent act. This was 2 children speaking, at the same moment, to 2 mothers who had died. One child with her voice, one with his feet. When the last note faded, the silence held for one more breath. Then, the auditorium detonated. The first person on his feet, clapping, before even the judges, was Tucker Vance. Denny won the showcase. But the trophy was not what he would remember most about that night. What he would remember happened in the corridor behind the auditorium, when Tucker stepped into his path, and instead of the smirk, the boy stuck out his hand, as if the arm weren't used to the motion. "The tray, back then," Tucker said, eyes on his shoes. I'm sorry." He paused, then went on in the voice of a kid confessing to something much bigger than a tray. "My dad says people only respect the guy standing on top of everybody else. My whole life I believed that. Then I watched you. Watched your little sister stand up and sing in front of the whole school with her legs about to give out. You two aren't standing on top of anybody. And the entire school stood up for you. He shrugged. I think my dad's wrong.
Denny looked at the outstretched hand. He remembered the scene in the pickup line, the boy shrinking under his father's shouting, the face of someone waiting to be seen. He shook Tucker's hand. "You can sit at my table at lunch," he said. "Just don't flip any trays. Food's precious." And for the first time, the two of them laughed together. At the back of the auditorium, Harlan stood watching his son hold the trophy and his daughter get swarmed by classmates, and he did not wipe his eyes. Because tonight, nobody in that room was bothering to hide their tears. The story hit the local paper within the week. From the underpass to the stage, Whitmore's adopted son wins Magnolia Prep Dance Showcase. Beneath the headline ran a photo of Denny in the spotlight, one hand extended forward. In a rundown rooming house on the south side of the city, in a room that smelled of cigarettes and wasted years, a man sat in front of an old television. When the photo appeared on the screen, his hand, a hand that had trembled with drink for years, rose and touched the glass and stopped on that extended arm. He knew that gesture. He had seen it 1,000 times in another boarding room from another woman. Wade Merrill sat motionless for a long time. Then he stood, opened a drawer, and took out the only thing left from his old life. 3 days later, a ragged figure appeared at the gate of the Live Oak estate.
Please,
His voice cracked at the guard.
let me see him. I'm his father.
Inside, Denny was laughing with Ivy at the dinner table when the butler entered, his face gone pale. The silence dropped over the table like a wet cloth. Ivy's fork stopped in midair. Denny went rigid, and in 1 second it all rushed back. The funeral, the empty bed, those first nights under the bridge when he still believed his father would come looking for him.
Bring him in.
"Show him in," Harlan said, his eyes never leaving his son. Wade Merrill entered the parlor like a man walking into a world he had no ticket for. Old clothes, a face carved with the lines of regret. But his eyes were locked on Denny. "Son, I saw you on the TV. You dance. You dance exactly like your mother." "You call yourself his father?" Harlan's voice was cold as dockyard steel. "Where were you when this boy slept under a bridge through 4 winters? Where were you when hunger nearly took his life?" Wade sank to his knees on the hardwood floor. "I failed. When Lorene died, I collapsed. I drank. I ran. I know there's no word that washes that away. But I saw him on that screen, alive, strong, shining. And I'm only asking for one chance." "You lost that right." Denny rose to his feet. His voice shook on the first word, then steadied, like a dance finding its rhythm. "When I was hungry, you weren't there. When I slept on the street, you weren't there. When I danced alone at that intersection, hoping some grown-up somewhere would stop and see me, you weren't there." Ivy had made her way to his side without anyone noticing, her steps slow but sure, and she took his hand. "I collapsed too, just like you. But I didn't run. I danced. And now I have a family. A family that doesn't leave anyone behind." Wade Merrill dropped his head. He didn't argue. Perhaps for 4 years, he had said those exact words to himself every night. He let the butler lead him toward the door. But at the threshold, he stopped, and with shaking hands drew from inside his coat a worn envelope, creased soft as cloth from years of being gripped,
and pressed it into the butler's hand. "I don't deserve to keep this anymore. It belongs to the boy." That night, alone in his room, Denny opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. The only photograph. Laureen Merrill, younger than he ever remembered her, dancing in the boarding room, hair tied low, bare feet on the wooden floor, one hand extended toward whoever held the camera, and in the right corner, beside the bed, an old radio. On the back, in a man's crooked handwriting, "Laureen, that spring. Never stop dancing." Denny carried the photograph to his desk and set it beside Ivy's watercolor. And he broke down. 2 pictures, one captured by a camera, one painted by a little girl from spoken words, identical down to the smallest detail. The angle of the hand, the tied-back hair, the position of the radio. Ivy had painted it right, uncannily right. Not through any miracle, but because Denny had remembered his mother with perfect precision for 4 years, with his entire body. The dance had never let her fade by a single line. He did not forgive his father that night. A 4-year wound does not close in one evening. But as he stared at the crooked handwriting on the back of the photograph, "Never stop dancing," he understood one small thing. The man had once loved the woman in that picture, had kept this photograph through 4 years of liquor and squalor, and had never sold it, even on the days he must have gone hungry. A seed was planted that night. It would need many years to sprout, but it was in the ground. Time at the Live Oak Estate passed like firefly seasons. 1 season a year, each one laying down another layer of light. Ivy grew up, and her legs grew up with her. The wobbling steps became steady ones. The steady steps became morning jogs around the garden with Denny, who always pretended to lose on the final lap, and she always knew, and they both always kept up the act. Every night, Ivy still sang the Firefly song, her voice confident now and true to the beat. She never again forgot her mother's voice. The song had become a keeping box, and every singing was a lifting of the lid. Denny studied so hard he regularly fell asleep face down in open books, and Harlan would carry him to bed like a much smaller child, and on those nights, the steel man of Savannah always lingered an extra minute at the bedside, just to look. Denny still danced every day. The photograph of his mother and Ivy's painting hung side by side on his wall, and before every exam, every milestone, he stood in front of the 2 images for a moment, as if asking permission. And Harlan changed in ways his acquaintances could not explain. He still went out to the stone bench every morning. He still talked to Rosalind. But now he told her the good news. Denny's grades, Ivy's running distances, the turkey they'd burned last Thanksgiving. The grief never disappeared. It simply learned how to sway. Then one autumn afternoon, many years on, when Denny was a grown man, a phone call came to the estate. A county hospital to the south. A patient named Wade Merrill was in his final days, and on the intake form, in the box marked next of kin, he had written only one name. Denny held the message slip for a long time. The old memories were still there, less faded than he had believed. Ivy, a young woman now, laid her hand over his. "Denny," she said, "forgiveness isn't a one-time act. It's a journey. And I think the last leg of this one is lying in a hospital room. You're not going because he deserves it. You're going so you don't have to carry this question for the rest of your life."
The hospital room was small and sharp with antiseptic. On the bed lay Wade Merrill, white-haired, wasted, his breath thin as paper. His eyes opened when the door cracked, and when he recognized the man standing there, they flooded instantly. "Son, I have nothing to give you. Never did. But if you could forgive me before I go." Denny stood in silence for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, he did two things. First, he drew from his jacket pocket the old photograph, the one that had been with him since that night at the threshold, and placed it in his father's trembling palm. "You keep her," he said quietly. "I don't need the picture anymore. I carry Mom somewhere else now." Second, right there in the cramped hospital room, Denny began to dance. The slow, fluid dance, one hand extended forward. The dance of the boarding room. Laureen's dance.
The eyes of the man on the bed went wide. "That dance," he breathed, tears running sideways across his temples into the pillow. "She danced it the first night I ever saw her. My God, she's still here." And Denny understood the last thing there was to understand. This man had loved his mother too, had lost her too, had been broken by the very same grief that had nearly broken Denny himself. The only difference being that no one had ever taught him the sentence, "Sitting still means the sadness wins." He had sat still, and the sadness had beaten him completely for an entire lifetime. Denny stopped and took the bony hand that was clutching the photograph. "I've carried this anger a long time, Dad," he said. "Today, I'm setting it down. I forgive you. Go in peace. The chain of sorrow ends here. I'm not passing it on to anyone." Wade Merrill wept quietly, his fingers closing around his son's hand and the picture of his lost wife. And that night, for the first time in his broken life, he slept a peaceful sleep, his last one. Denny left the hospital as the sky was turning light. Ivy was waiting in the parking lot. She asked nothing. She only opened her arms. "You gave him his rest," she said. "And you just unlocked a chain you've worn so long, you thought it was part of your bones." Denny did not end his journey with his own healing. At 23, with Harlan's backing, he founded a small organization on the south side of Savannah, in the old bus station district, called First Steps. It built safe shelters for street children, provided meals, provided schooling. But what made it different from every other shelter was that each afternoon at 4 o'clock, exactly 4 o'clock, music rose from the back courtyard, and Denny taught the children to dance. Not to make dancers of them, but because he understood, better than anyone alive, that when a child is hungry and alone, sitting still means the sadness wins. On opening day, the small hall was packed with ragged children wearing wary eyes. Eyes Denny knew by heart. He stood before them in plain clothes and canvas shoes, no suit. "I used to be you," he said, his voice catching exactly where he knew it would catch. "I used to sleep under the overpass 3 blocks from here. I used to eat fast because I was afraid it would be snatched. I know what it feels like to be invisible. But today, hear me. You are not invisible anymore. You are seen. And starting today, you have an address." A few weeks later, one of the boys in the shelter, skinny, silent, with eyes older than his years, shyly tugged at Denny's sleeve. "Sir, could you teach me to dance? I want to forget that I'm hungry." Denny knelt down to the boy's eye level. In that instant, 15 years folded in half, and he was looking at himself. He took the small hand and placed it on his own, exactly as Laureen had done in the boarding room, exactly as he had done with Ivy in the garden. "Of course," he said. "I'll teach you the dance my mother taught me. One condition: someday, you teach it to another kid. That way, this dance can never die." Ivy, now a reporter at Savannah's largest newspaper, wrote a series about the children of first steps, writing them not as objects of pity, but as small warriors, exactly the way she had once wished to be seen from her wheelchair. The series traveled far. Donors found their way to the door. A second shelter opened in Atlanta, then a third in Charleston. The Firefly song was sung every night in all 3 houses by children who had no idea who wrote it. They only knew it as the lamplighting song. And then, one late summer evening, as the sun turned the Savannah sky to gold, every road in this story led back to where it began, the garden of the Live Oak Estate. Harlan Whitmore sat on the stone bench beneath the great oak. He was old now, his hair as white as the Spanish moss above his head, but his eyes were at peace. Before him, Denny and Ivy, 2 grown people in whom every trace of the wheelchair and the underpass had long healed over, were setting the outdoor table for the family dinner. And on that table, as at every meal for all those years, one place was fully set at a chair where no one sat. Some things had healed miraculously, and one thing never would. Rosalind did not come back. Laureen did not come back. The chair stayed empty. The stone bench still received an old man every morning. Healing had never meant the wound disappears. It only means a person learns to carry it and still walk on. Still add chairs to the table. Still light the lamps. While they waited on the food, Ivy began absently humming the Firefly song. And Denny, hearing the melody, set down his stack of plates and extended one hand forward, the exact gesture from the old photograph, the exact gesture from the watercolor painting. "Dance with me?" Ivy laid her hand on his, and in the gold-drenched garden, beneath oaks 200 years old, 2 children who had once lost everything began to dance. A dance born in a poor boarding room whose address no one remembered, set to a song written for a baby in a mansion, both of them now belonging to anyone who needed them. Harlan sat on the stone bench and watched. He offered no closing wisdom. He only watched his 2 children turning on the grass and watched the evening's first fireflies begin to light their lamps around the garden. One spark, then another, patient, as if 2 mothers were out there kindling them one by one, to shine a light on what they had left behind in this world. And in that flickering glow, the house that had once held only silence now rang with the richest sound a lifetime can gather. The footsteps of a dance that will never die, and the singing of a song that no one will ever forget.